Today we're going to add special parallelograms to our list of quadrilaterals that we've studied. So these shapes that I'm going to talk about with you are parallelograms. So everything on this page is a parallelogram. So every characteristic that a parallelogram has, a rectangle also has, and then some additional characteristics. Every characteristic that a parallelogram has also applies to the rhombus and also applies to the square. So these 5 characteristics plus the new ones that go with each shape. So we'll start with a rectangle. A rectangle, by definition, is a parallelogram, I should have drawn the picture, with 4 right angles. So if you take all of the characteristics of a parallelogram and add another one, the fact that these are all right angles, you have a rectangle. So remember, a rectangle, the diagonals bisect each other. Obviously these angles are supplementary because they're 90 and 90. The opposite sides are congruent. That's something you probably learned in elementary school. So that's what's special about a rectangle. Now we go to a rhombus. A rhombus has a few special things about it. A rhombus is a parallelogram that has 4 congruent sides. So you take your parallelogram and all of its characteristics and add in the fact that all 4 sides are congruent. You have a rhombus. And a rhombus also has an additional characteristic that the diagonals are perpendicular. So when the diagonals intersect here in the center, that's not a straight line, but you get the idea. They're perpendicular here in the center. The diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. The diagonals of a rhombus do one more thing. The diagonals bisect, each diagonal bisects 2 angles. So when I draw my diagonal in my rhombus, this angle is bisected and this angle is bisected. One diagonal bisects both angles. And the same thing is true about this diagonal. It bisects both of those angles. So we end up with 4 right triangles in our rhombus, and the hypotenuse is the outside of the rhombus. So extra characteristics of a rhombus: 4 congruent sides, the diagonals are perpendicular, and the diagonals bisect 2 of the angles. One diagonal bisects 2 angles. And remember, this angle up here is different than this angle right here. So these angles are not congruent. The opposite angles are the ones that are congruent. And then we move on to this square. I always joke that the rectangle and the rhombus had a baby, and it was a square, because a square has all the characteristics of a rhombus and a rectangle. I nicknamed it a romtangle, but that's not a thing. That's just something I say. So we're going to say that a square is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides, that makes it like a rhombus, and 4 right angles, which makes it like a rectangle. So everything we just said about a rhombus and a rectangle, all of these characteristics go for a square. And I want to point something out to you. When we draw our diagonal in our square, think about it. This angle was 90 degrees. It's a right angle. Now, because it's a rhombus, that diagonal just bisected the angle. So half of 90 is 45. Look what we just made. We just made a 45, 45, 90 triangle. So anytime you cut your square in half, you have created a 45, 45, 90 triangle. And we could very well bring back those special right triangles where the legs were each equal to x and the hypotenuse was x root 2, and I have nowhere to put that. So be ready with your right triangles. A square cuts into a 45, 45, 90 triangle. So let's take these characteristics of the special quadrilaterals and put them into practice. So we're on the day 3 pictures of this worksheet now. So this one says find the values of the rectangle. So they've told us this is a rectangle. So I know that this is 90 degrees. They're all 90 degrees. So let's see what we can figure out here. Well, I could use the fact that this is a right angle. 90 minus 28 should be 62. So I know this is 28 and 62. Oh, could I use the alternate interior angles to help me? That's a possibility. So notice these are the alternate interior angles. So if this one is also 28, then y must be 62. That's helpful. Now, here's something to remember. You know how we said in a parallelogram the diagonals bisect each other? I forgot to mention that in a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. Because we've squared everything up, now if I draw a line from here to here, it's going to be congruent to the other diagonal. So that's an important addition to our rectangle property. The diagonals are congruent. So if this diagonal was congruent to this one, and they were both bisected, wouldn't it make sense that they were all the same? The diagonals bisect each other, and in a rectangle, the diagonals happen to be congruent. So this t value here is 5. Well, what do you know? Look at this triangle at the top of the picture. If this is 5 and this is 5, what kind of triangle did we just create? An isosceles triangle. That means W has to be 28, just like the 28 over here. And what happens on the bottom? Well, again, isosceles triangle, so these are both 28. So over on the side where we're looking for x degrees, there's a couple of ways we could do it. I could add 28 and 28 and subtract it from 180. And I think that's 124, but I will check to be sure. So if this angle is 124, how do I find x? Well, subtracting 124 from 180, and we get back to that 56. That had to do with the exterior angles right there. That this angle would be these two added together. You could have also found that because this is an isosceles triangle, so these both had to be 62. And then you could find the 56 from there. So there's a lot in a rectangle when you start putting all those properties together. Just refresh your memory. 4 right angles and the diagonals are congruent. And you'll notice when the diagonals cut through here, we've got a lot of congruent triangles that are created. Those come in handy sometimes too. All right, number 9 is a rhombus. So all the characteristics of rhombus come to play here. So they've given us the fact that this diagonal from top to bottom is 24. This piece of this diagonal is 5. And they want us to find a bunch of other things. Well, what do we know about the diagonals again? The diagonals bisect each other. So, if the whole thing is 24, wouldn't that make this 12 and 12? We also know that the diagonals are perpendicular. So this is a right angle, making this a right triangle. Oh, I'm going to do the Pythagorean theorem to find out G. So I'll say 5 squared plus 12 squared equals G squared. And if you recognize a Pythagorean triple, you'll know that G is 13. If you don't recognize the Pythagorean triple, then use the Pythagorean theorem and find out. So next, let's look at the angles. If I know this angle is 90, I can do 90 minus 22 and subtract that from 180 and find my missing angle is 68. Now I need to look at E and D down here. So remember, in a parallelogram, the opposite angles are congruent and the diagonals bisect the angles in a rhombus. So this angle was bisected, so it's now 22 and 22. This angle down here is congruent to that angle. So D is 22. The same thing is true for this side over here. If F is 68, then this is 68, and this angle is congruent to that, so I get 68 again. So the characteristics of a rhombus, we have all the parallelogram characteristics, plus the diagonals are perpendicular, and the diagonals bisect these opposite angles. So that's how we solved that one. And it looks like that is the end of our practice for today.